In 1992, Australians were promised a retirement revolution. 3% employer super contributions, rising over time, would compound into financial security, and the age pension would become just a safety net. But fast forward to 2026, the average retiree's super falls short by over $200,000, and 1 in 4 Australians aged over 60 has less than $200,000 to their name. Many, especially women, now rely almost entirely on the age pension, which sits well below the cost of dignity in our biggest cities. If you feel you did everything right, but still find your super is not enough, this is not a personal failure, it is exactly what the numbers show for millions. So what went wrong between the promise and the reality? The real story behind the Australian retirement gap starts here. On the 30th of June 1992, Paul Keating stood in Parliament and described a new vision for Australian retirement. The superannuation guarantee would begin with a modest 3% employer contribution, but the plan was for this to rise steadily, first to 9% by 2002, and in time, even higher. The idea was simple. As these contributions grew and compounded over decades, every working Australian would build a nest egg large enough to ensure dignity and independence in retirement. Treasury's original models assumed uninterrupted full-time work for 40 years, with super balances growing at 6 to 7% a year after fees. If you started at age 25 and worked through to 65, the numbers promised a comfortable retirement, enough to make the AJ pension a true safety net, not a main source of income. The rhetoric was nation-building, and the mood in the early 1990s was hopeful. Union leaders and government economists spoke of a future where retirees would no longer fear poverty or dependence. For many, this blueprint offered the first real sense of security after a lifetime of work. By 2026, the numbers tell a stark story. The average superannuation balance for Australians aged 65 to 69 sits at about $382,000. But that figure hides a wide gap. Half of retirees have less than $163,000 in superannuation, and women's median balances are roughly $100,000 lower than men's. The benchmark for a comfortable retirement, set by the Association of Superannuation Funds of Australia, is $595,000 for a single person and $690,000 for a couple, assuming you own your home and receive a part-age pension. That leaves the average retiree short by more than $200,000, enough to turn dreams of security into daily budgeting. For 1 in 4 Australians over 60, superannuation balances are below $200,000, meaning they rely almost entirely on the age pension, which pays about $30,600 a year for a single person and $46,200 for a couple. In cities like Sydney or Melbourne, those numbers barely cover rent, let alone health costs or a modest holiday. The promise of a nest egg big enough for independence has, for many, become a gap that only widens with age. A closer look at who is retiring today reveals a problem built into the very bones of the superannuation system. Most Australians now in their mid-60s or older were already well into their careers when compulsory super began in 1992. For them, the promised decades of steady compounding contributions never materialised. Instead, they entered the system halfway through the journey, with employer payments starting at just 3% of wages and only reaching 9% a decade later. Treasury's own modelling shows that the first group to experience a full working life under the designed settings, starting work at 25, never stopping and receiving the full benefit of higher rates, will not reach retirement until the 2040s. For everyone before that, especially today's retirees, the math was always going to fall short. That is why 1 in 4 people over 60 has less than $200,000 in super, and why the average balance lags so far behind the so-called comfortable standard. This was not about personal missteps. It was a simple mismatch between policy timing and lived reality. The reality for most current retirees was set in motion long before they ever reached the finish line. The superannuation system's original promise depended on decades of steady, rising contributions. Yet for those retiring today, the ramp was painfully slow. Employer payments started at just 3% in 1992 and only reached 9% a decade later, staying stuck there for nearly 20 years. According to Treasury modelling, if contributions had hit 12% sooner, retirees could have ended up with 30 to 40% more in their accounts. That missing compounding isn't just a rounding error, it's the difference between scraping by and living with security. But the design also assumed a neat, uninterrupted working life, 40 years, full-time, no breaks. That's never matched real experience, especially for women. Life events such as raising children, caring for family, and periods of part-time work or unemployment cut directly into super balances. The numbers are stark. The median balance for women is about 22% lower than for men, a gap of nearly $100,000 by retirement age. For many, these factors meant their super was handicapped from the start, long before fees or market swings ever took their share. Hidden within every superannuation statement is a cost that most people never see. It is the relentless bite of fees. In the early years, many Australians were placed in retail funds, charging up to 2% in annual fees, bundled with insurance premiums and trailing commissions. That might sound small, but the effect over a working life is anything but. According to modelling by Chant West, the difference between paying 2% in fees compared to 0.8% adds up to around $150,000 lost for someone on a typical income over 40 years. That is money that should have been compounding for retirement, quietly siphoned away. For many, these fees are buried in fine print or scattered across multiple accounts, making them almost invisible. Yet their impact is enormous, often the gap between a modest but secure retirement and years of anxiety about making ends meet. The superannuation industry now manages more than $4.5 trillion in assets. But for individual retirees, high fees have quietly eroded the very nest eggs they were promised. The numbers are not just abstract. They are the reason so many Australians find themselves falling short, no matter how carefully they planned. Janet spent more than 30 years in the classroom, starting her teaching career in the mid-1980s. She worked full-time for most of her 20s and 30s, but took 5 years out to raise her children, and later returned part-time to care for her ageing mother. By the time compulsory superannuation kicked in, Janet was already halfway through her working life. Her employer contributions started at just 3% of her salary and only reached 9% after a decade. For years, her superannuation grew slowly, never fast enough to catch up with the promise of a comfortable retirement. Now, at 67, Janet's superannuation balance sits around $375,000. She draws down about $15,000 a year, what the government's own calculators recommend to make her savings last. The age pension tops this up with another $30,600, but even combined, her income still falls short of the standard for a modest but comfortable life by more than $6,000 a year, a gap. For Janet, that gap is not just a number on a page. It means saying no to visits with her grandchildren interstate, skipping the dentist, and watching every grocery bill. She did everything right, worked hard, saved, and trusted the system. Yet the arithmetic leaves her with less than she needs year after year. This is not about individual failure. It is the result of a structural failure that never matched real working lives. Australians with moderate super balances, somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000, find themselves in what is often called the pension twilight zone. They have saved too much to qualify for the full-age pension, but not enough to stop worrying about bills, health costs, or even a sudden rent increase. Services Australia data shows that nearly 70% of people over 65 still rely on the age pension in some form. For those in the twilight band, every extra dollar in super can mean a sharp drop in pension payments, making their hard-earned savings feel less like a safety net and more like a penalty. This is not a rare edge case. It is a reality for hundreds of thousands of retirees who did everything by the book, only to discover the system's rules can punish, not reward, careful saving. Australia's superannuation system now manages more than $4.3 trillion, making it one of the largest retirement savings pools on the planet. The scale is staggering, bigger than the nation's entire annual economic output. But for millions of ordinary retirees, that mountain of money might as well be on another continent. The industry's growth has delivered record profits to fund managers and banks, with headline-grabbing figures that suggest abundance. Yet the lived experience is scarcity. While the system boasts global prestige, the reality for individuals is a constant squeeze, watching balances shrink faster than expected, and knowing that the comfort promised in policy speeches never quite arrived. The paradox is hard to ignore. A country rich in retirement savings, but with too many retirees still counting every dollar. When retirees are forced to work longer because their savings fall short, it is not just a personal burden, it ripples through the economy. Fewer older Australians leave the workforce, making it harder for younger people to find jobs. Lower retiree spending drags on growth, costing up to 0.5% of gross domestic product each year, according to Reserve Bank of Australia estimates. Fixing this means more than just patching holes. Treasury modelling points to a menu of reforms, indexing the age pension to real living costs, making super access rules fairer for those with low balances, and softening means testing for moderate savers. For the next generation, lifting the super rate to 15%, adding superannuation credits for parental leave, and capping fees at 0.5% could finally deliver on the original promise. These are not radical ideas, just overdue steps to match policy with reality. Right now, hundreds of thousands of Australians face retirement with dignity. Out of reach, not for lack of effort, but because the system was never built for real lives. Until policy matches lived, reality, anxiety and unfairness will remain. The next chapter depends on what we choose to fix.